Welcome to our deep dive all about U.S. China trade. You sent us a really interesting stack of materials this time,
It is a fascinating topic.
including some really in-depth reports from the Congressional Research Service. It seems like you're really trying to get to the bottom of what's really going on between these two economic giants.
Yeah,
So let's dive in.
you're absolutely right. It's tempting to think it's all just about soybeans and tariffs.
Yeah, just like a surface level thing.
But trust me, there's a whole lot more beneath the surface.
Okay.
We're going to untangle this intricate web of trade in goods and services investments, and even the impact on specific industries.
Right, because you mentioned aerospace and semiconductors in your notes.
Exactly.
Yeah, those definitely caught my eye in the reports.
Yeah.
Okay, so first things first, let's talk about the scale of this trade relationship.
Sure.
The reports mention China being a top U.S. trading partner. But I need more than that. Just how big is this thing?
Well, think hundreds of billions of dollars annually. To give you a concrete number, in 2023 alone, the total trade between the U.S. and China was a staggering $575 billion.
Wow.
That made China America's fourth largest goods trading partner.
$575 billion.
Yeah.
That's
A lot.
a lot of iPhones.
A lot of everything.
And this trade goes both ways, right?
Exactly.
It's not just us shipping stuff over to China.
It's a two-way street. China is a major source of imports for the U.S. A&D, a key market for American exports.
Okay.
We buy a lot of their stuff, and they buy a lot of ours. And it's not just cheap consumer goods either. We're talking about a huge range of products, from raw materials to high-tech components.
You know, it's funny because I was just reading an article the other day about how much of our everyday stuff is actually made in China.
Yes!
It's really intertwined with our lives in ways we don't even realize.
It really is. And speaking of things we don't always think about,
Yeah,
you also sent us some information about services,
right.
not just the tangible goods we can hold.
Yeah, that part was interesting to me because I honestly always forget that services are such a big part of international trade.
Yeah.
What kinds of services are we talking about here?
Well, think about things like travel and tourism.
Okay.
Chinese tourists coming to the U.S. or Americans visiting China. Then there's intellectual property licensing, where American companies allow Chinese companies to use their patents or trademarks.
Okay.
And of course, there's transportation, shipping goods back and forth across the Pacific.
So it's not just about what we buy and sell, it's about how those things get moved around the world, too.
Exactly. And here's where it gets interesting.
Okay.
The U.S. actually has a trade surplus in services with China.
Wait, a surplus?
Uh-huh.
Remind me what that means again.
It means we export more services to China than we import from them.
Okay. So that's good for the U.S., right?
Yeah.
A surplus generally means we're coming out ahead.
In theory, yes, but it's not the whole picture. Because when it comes to goods, the physical stuff, the U.S. has a large trade deficit with China. We import significantly more goods from them than we export to them.
So it's kind of like a seesaw then?
Yeah.
Up on services, down on goods?
That's a good way to put it.
Okay.
But this isn't just some friendly competition.
Yeah.
Because there's another layer to all of this that you highlighted in your sources.
Yeah.
This idea of strategic competition and concerns.
Yeah, this phrase has definitely caught my attention. What exactly are we talking about here?
Well, it's important to remember that China's economic system is structured very differently from ours.
Okay.
It's much more tightly controlled by the government.
Right.
And this can create an uneven playing field for American businesses.
That makes sense. Can you give me a concrete example of how this plays out in the real world?
Sure. Take the aerospace industry.
Okay.
You mentioned this in your notes, so you're clearly interested in this sector. Some U.S. companies that wanted to participate in developing a Chinese commercial aircraft,
Right.
the C919,
Yes.
found they had to partner with Chinese state-owned firms.
Oh, wow.
And in some cases, they even had to transfer their technology to these partners.
So it's like they're being forced to give up their secrets just to get a foot in the door.
That's one way to look at it. And it raises concerns about whether American companies are being treated fairly in the Chinese market.
Yeah.
And this isn't just limited to aerospace.
Right. Because I also flagged a section in one of the reports about the semiconductor industry, which is huge these days.
And it's a perfect example of this strategic competition. China has been pouring resources into building up its own domestic semiconductor industry,
Okay.
even using imported U.S. equipment, with the goal of becoming a global leader.
So they're using our own technology to potentially outcompete us. That's kind of a wild thought.
It is, and it's a source of real concern for policymakers in Washington. It's a delicate balance trying to encourage trade and economic cooperation while also protecting American interests.
Okay, I'm starting to see the complexity here.
Yeah.
So with all these concerns you mentioned, what is the U.S. actually doing about it? Are we just sitting back and watching this all happen?
Not exactly.
Yeah.
The U.S. government has a few tools in its toolbox to address these challenges.
Okay.
For one, tariffs have been imposed on many Chinese goods to try to level the playing field and protect American industries.
Right, the tariffs, I remember those being all over the news a few years back.
They were a big deal, and they're still largely in effect today. And there's been talk of potentially expanding them to new products like electric vehicles.
Interesting. So are tariffs a good thing or a bad thing?
That's a complex question, and there's no easy answer. Some argue that tariffs protect American jobs and industries from unfair competition. Others argue that they raise prices for consumers and hurt businesses that rely on imported goods. There's no denying that tariffs have a ripple effect throughout the economy.
I guess it depends on who you ask and which side of the trade they're on. Speaking of ripple effects, I also came across something called the de minimis rule in one of these reports. It sounds like a loophole.
It is, in a way.
Yeah.
Basically, if you buy something online from China and it costs less than $800, it can enter the U.S. duty-free.
Wait, seriously?
No tariffs, no taxes.
So I could buy like a whole bunch of stuff online from China and avoid those extra costs. That doesn't seem fair to American businesses.
That's exactly the argument some people are making. They say this loophole is creating a huge surge in imports from China, hurting American businesses and making it harder for them to compete.
So it's like this unintended consequence of trying to make things easier for consumers.
You could say that.
Yeah.
And it's just highlights how interconnected everything is in this relationship. One decision can have all sorts of unexpected consequences.
This is a lot to take in. I'm starting to understand why those concerns were highlighted in the reports.
And we've only just scratched the surface. But before we get even deeper into the weeds,
Okay.
let's step back for a second to talk about the bigger picture.
Yeah.
For someone like you trying to make sense of all of this, what's the key takeaway so far?
Well, I guess the main thing that's hitting me is that this U.S. China trade relationship is a lot more complex than I ever imagined. It's not just about buying cheap stuff from China. It's about economics, technology, and maybe even national security. And it seems like there are no easy answers.
You're absolutely right. This is a relationship that's vital to both economies, but it's also fraught with challenges and potential pitfalls. There's a lot at stake here, and how it all plays out will have ripple effects felt around the world.
Speaking of ripple effects, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, China's influence over certain industries, like the example of electric vehicle batteries. Can you tell me more about that? Why is that such a big deal?
Sure. You're right to focus on this because it really highlights the strategic dimension of this trade relationship. China has made a concerted effort to dominate the electric vehicle industry, and a key part of that is their control over the production of EV batteries.
I'm with you so far, but why are batteries so important? I mean, they're just batteries, right?
They're much more than that. Think of it this way. The battery is the heart of an electric vehicle.
Okay.
It determines how far the car can go, how fast it can charge, and ultimately how much it costs.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. So if China controls the batteries, they essentially control the electric vehicle market.
In a way, yes. And it goes beyond just cars. These batteries are also essential for a whole range of other technologies, from smartphones and laptops to renewable energy storage. So we're talking about a potentially massive amount of economic and technological power concentrated in one country.
Wow, that is kind of scary when you think about it like that. So it's not just about trade deficits and tariffs. It's about who controls the future of these critical technologies.
Exactly. And that's what makes this relationship so fascinating and so challenging. It's a constant balancing act between cooperation and competition, between economic interests and national security.
Well, you've definitely given me a lot to think about. I'm already starting to look at my Made in China labels in a whole new light. But before we move on to some of the other topics you mentioned, I'm curious about something else that was highlighted in the reports, this issue of forced labor in China.
Okay.
That's a pretty heavy topic, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
It's definitely a serious issue that we can't ignore. There have been numerous reports of forced labor being used in various industries in China, including the production of cotton solar panels and even electronics.
That's disturbing. And I know that the U.S. has laws prohibiting the import of products made with forced labor.
Right.
Is that something that's actively being enforced?
Yes, it is. Congress has passed legislation specifically aimed at addressing this issue, like the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act.
Oh, okay.
This law bans imports from the Xinjiang region of China unless companies can prove that their supply chains are free of forced labor.
So it's not just about the economic side of trade, but also about the ethical considerations, making sure we're not supporting businesses that exploit people.
Exactly. The U.S. has a responsibility to ensure that the products it imports are not made under these conditions. It's a matter of upholding human rights and ensuring ethical sourcing practices.
I'm glad to hear that this is being taken seriously. It definitely adds another layer of complexity to the whole U.S. China trade relationship.
It does. And it's a reminder that this relationship is about more than just dollars and cents. It's about values, principles, and the kind of world we want to live in.
Well said. This has been incredibly eye-opening so far. You've really given me a lot to consider. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive...
Yes. What's on your mind?
Well, I'm curious about your take on something. You mentioned how much this relationship has evolved even in just the past few years.
Yeah.
The pandemic supply chain disruptions, the growing technological competition, it all seems to be accelerating certain trends. Where do you see this all heading? Is this a sustainable relationship in the long run, or are we headed for some kind of major clash?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And honestly, nobody knows for sure. But what I can say is this. The U.S. China relationship is one of the most important and defining relationships of the 21st century. It's going to shape the global landscape for decades to come.
No pressure, then. But you're right, it's hard to overstate the significance of this relationship. So while we can't predict the future, are there any signs that point to how things might unfold? What should we be paying attention to?
There are a few key things to watch.
Okay.
First, the level of economic interdependence. Despite all the talk of decoupling and reshoring, the U.S. and China are still deeply intertwined economically. It's going to be very difficult and costly for either country to completely disentangle itself from the other.
That makes sense. It's like trying to unbake a cake.
Exactly.
The ingredients are already mixed together. But does that mean we're stuck in this kind of uneasy coexistence forever, always trying to balance cooperation with competition?
It's certainly a possibility, but there are also efforts underway to manage this relationship and address some of the concerns we've been talking about.
Okay.
For example, the Biden administration has created bilateral working groups with China to discuss specific issues like financial regulations, commercial disputes, and export controls.
So talking it out instead of fighting it out, that sounds like a more diplomatic approach.
It is. It's a way to keep the lines of communication open and try to find common ground on some of these thorny issues.
But is everyone on board with this approach? I imagine there are some people who think we need to take a tougher stance on China.
You're absolutely right. There are definitely voices in Congress on both sides of the aisle who are skeptical of this engagement strategy. They argue that these working groups are just a way for China to stall and avoid making any real changes to their policies. They believe we need to be more assertive in defending American interests.
So it's kind of a tug of war then,
Yeah.
between those who want to engage with China and those who want to confront them. How does this play out in practice?
Well, we're seeing this debate play out in a variety of ways. For example, Congress has passed legislation to restrict Chinese digital platforms like TikTok over concerns about data security and potential influence from the Chinese government.
Right, I remember that being a big story. It seems like those concerns about data security and technological competition are only growing.
They are. And Congress is actively looking at ways to address these concerns. They're considering bills to regulate U.S. outbound investment, which would limit the ability of American companies to invest in certain sectors in China. They're also looking at ways to restrict Chinese investment in the U.S. market, particularly in sensitive industries like technology and infrastructure. And there's growing concern about research ties between American universities and Chinese institutions. Some lawmakers want to limit these collaborations to prevent the transfer of sensitive technologies.
Wow, it sounds like they're really trying to cover all the bases.
Yeah.
But let's go back to something we talked about earlier, China's influence over specific sectors. You used the example of electric vehicle batteries.
Right.
I'm really curious to hear more about that.
Absolutely. It's a prime example of how China is leveraging its economic power to gain a strategic advantage in key industries. They've invested heavily in the entire electric vehicle ecosystem, from mining the raw materials to manufacturing the batteries to assembling the finished vehicles.
Okay, so they're not just making batteries, they're controlling the whole supply chain.
Exactly. And that gives them a lot of leverage, not just over the auto industry, but over the entire global transition to electric vehicles. Countries that want to adopt EVs will be increasingly reliant on China for the batteries that power those vehicles.
So if you control the batteries, you control the cars, and maybe even the future of transportation.
That's the idea. And it's not just cars either. These batteries are essential for so many other technologies. Think about smartphones, laptops, even the large-scale batteries needed to store renewable energy from solar and wind power.
Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture here.
Yeah.
This isn't just about cars, it's about who controls the technologies that will power the 21st century.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's a wake-up call for the U.S.
Yeah.
We need to be investing in our own capabilities in these critical areas if we want to remain competitive on the global stage.
So it's not just about reacting to what China is doing, it's about proactively investing in our own future.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
We can't just sit back and watch as other countries take the lead in these critical technologies.
That makes sense. Now, I know we've been talking a lot about China's growing influence, but I don't want to paint a picture of China as some unstoppable force. I'm sure they have their own challenges and vulnerabilities too, right?
Of course. No country is without its challenges. China is facing its own set of economic headwinds, including slowing growth, rising debt levels, and an aging population. They also have significant environmental challenges to address, including air and water pollution. And there are social and political tensions simmering beneath the surface.
So it's not all smooth sailing for China.
Not at all. It's important to remember that China is a complex country with its own internal dynamics and challenges. We shouldn't oversimplify things or fall into the trap of thinking of China as a monolithic entity.
I appreciate that perspective. It's easy to get caught up in the headlines and forget that we're dealing with real people, not just abstract economic or political forces.
Right.
But circling back to this idea of strategic competition, what are some of the other sectors where China is making a play for global dominance?
Well, we've already talked about semiconductors, which are essential for pretty much every electronic device we use. China is pouring resources into developing its own domestic semiconductor industry, and they're making progress. This has raised serious concerns in the U.S. about our dependence on foreign sources for these critical components.
Because if we're reliant on China for chips, we're essentially vulnerable to them.
Exactly. It's a national security issue as well as an economic one. Imagine a scenario where tensions between the U.S. and China escalate, and China decides to cut off our supply of semiconductors. It would cripple our economy and our military.
Okay, that's a sobering thought. So what can we do to mitigate this risk?
Well, there are a few things. First, we need to invest in our own domestic semiconductor manufacturing capacity.
Okay.
We need to bring those jobs back to the U.S. and ensure that we have a secure and reliable supply of these critical components.
So it's not just about restricting trade with China, it's about rebuilding our own industrial base.
Exactly. And it's not just about semiconductors. We need to be thinking about other critical sectors where we're vulnerable to foreign dependence, like pharmaceuticals, rare earth minerals, and even certain agricultural products.
It sounds like we have our work cut out for us, but I want to switch gears for a moment and go back to something you mentioned earlier, the cultural dimension of the U.S. China relationship. I'm intrigued by that, and I feel like we haven't really explored it yet.
You're right. That's an important aspect that often gets overlooked. As China's economic and political power has grown, so too has its cultural influence.
Okay, I'm all ears. Give me some examples.
Well, think about the rise of Chinese cinema. Movies like Wolf Warrior 2 and The Wandering Earth have been huge box office hits, not just in China, but around the world.
I've actually heard of those. I may have even seen one on a plane somewhere. So Chinese movies are starting to compete with Hollywood.
They are, and it's not just movies. Chinese music, fashion, food, all of these are becoming more popular globally. And Chinese social media platforms like TikTok and WeChat are attracting millions of users outside of China.
So it's not just about trade in goods and services, but also in ideas and cultural trends.
Exactly. And this can have a profound impact on how the world perceives China. It can challenge stereotypes and promote a more nuanced understanding of Chinese culture and society.
It's interesting to think about how culture and soft power can play a role in shaping international relations. It's not always about military might or economic dominance.
You're absolutely right. And it's something that China's been very savvy about. They understand the power of culture to influence hearts and minds.
I'm realizing that this conversation could go on for hours. There's so much to unpack here, but I want to be mindful of your time. Before we wrap up, is there anything else that really struck you in all this research? Anything that surprised you or that you think our listeners should really ponder?
What's fascinating to me is how dynamic this relationship is.
Yeah.
It's constantly evolving, and there are so many factors at play.
Yeah.
I think it's important for people to understand that this is not a static situation. We can't just look at the headlines or the latest trade figures and think we have a complete picture. We need to be paying attention to the long-term trends, the underlying forces that are shaping this relationship.
So it's not just about the what, it's about the why. Understanding the deeper motivations and the historical context.
Exactly. And I think that's something that often gets lost in the noise of daily events.
Yeah.
We need to step back and take a more holistic view if we want to truly grasp the complexity of this relationship.
I completely agree. This has been an incredibly insightful conversation. I feel like I've learned so much, and I'm sure our listener has too. But before we say goodbye,
Yes.
I have one final question that's been on my mind. We've talked about the economic, technological, and cultural aspects of the U.S. China relationship, but what about the human element? How does all of this impact the lives of everyday people in both countries?
That's a great question and one that's often overlooked. At the end of the day, this relationship is about people. It's about the workers in both countries whose jobs are affected by trade flows. It's about the consumers who benefit from lower prices on imported goods. It's about the students who are studying abroad and building bridges between cultures. It's about the families who are separated by borders but connected by shared aspirations.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And it reminds us that we're not just dealing with abstract forces or competing ideologies. We're dealing with real human lives, hopes, and dreams.
Exactly. And I think that's something we should never forget.
Well said. This has been an incredible deep dive. I feel like I've gained a much deeper understanding of this complex and consequential relationship. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with me and with our listener.
It's been my pleasure. I'm
Yeah.
always happy to talk about this topic, and I hope this conversation has been enlightening for everyone.
I'm sure it has. And I hope it's sparked a desire to learn even more. This is just the beginning of the conversation. There's always more to explore, more to understand, and more to appreciate about this fascinating and ever-changing relationship.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, thank you again for joining us on this journey. And until next time, keep those brains curious. I think you've really hit the nail on the head there. It's easy to get lost in the numbers and the policy debates, but ultimately this relationship boils down to the interactions between people.
Absolutely. And that human element is something to keep in mind as we try to make sense of where things might be headed.
So speaking of where things might be headed, you mentioned earlier how dynamic this relationship is. Do you see any particular trends or developments that could significantly impact the future of U.S. China trade?
There are a couple of things that stand out to me. One is this increasing focus on resilience and supply chain diversification.
Yeah.
The pandemic really exposed the vulnerabilities of global supply chains.
Right.
And we're seeing both the U.S. and China taking steps to reduce their dependence on each other for critical goods.
You know, come to think of it, I remember reading an article about how some American companies are starting to move their manufacturing operations out of China, or at least trying to find additional suppliers in other countries.
Exactly.
Is that what you're talking about?
It's called reshoring or nearshoring, and it's a trend that's likely to continue in the coming years. Companies are realizing that relying too heavily on a single country for their supplies can be risky.
That makes sense, especially after all the disruptions we've seen in recent years. So does this mean we're headed for a world where the U.S. and China are less economically intertwined, a sort of decoupling?
It's a possibility, but it's not necessarily a foregone conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's more likely that we'll see a shift towards a more diversified and regionalized global economy. The U.S. and China will still be major players, but they'll also be looking to strengthen ties with other countries and regions.
So a more multipolar world.
Precisely. And that could actually be a good thing. A more diversified global economy could be more resilient to shocks and disruptions. It could also create new opportunities for other countries to emerge as economic powerhouses.
I hadn't thought about it that way, but that's an interesting perspective. It's not just about the U.S. and China. It's about the shifting dynamics of the entire global system.
Exactly. And that brings us to the second trend. I wanted to mention the increasing competition in emerging technologies. We've already talked about semiconductors, but this competition is playing out in other areas as well, like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and biotechnology.
Those are all areas where China has been making significant investments. Do you think they have a chance to overtake the U.S. in these fields?
It's certainly possible. China has a number of advantages, including a large pool of talented engineers and scientists, a government that's willing to invest heavily in research and development, and a vast domestic market that can be used to test and refine new technologies.
So it's not just about catching up anymore, it's about taking the lead.
That's how they see it. And it's a challenge that the U.S. needs to take seriously. We can't afford to rest on our laurels or assume that our technological dominance is a given. We need to be investing in education, research, and innovation if we want to stay ahead of the curve.
It's interesting to think about how this technological competition is intertwined with the broader geopolitical rivalry between the U.S. and China. It's not just about economic dominance, it's about who sets the rules of the road for the 21st century.
Absolutely. And that's why this relationship is so complex and consequential. It's not just about trade figures or political posturing. It's about shaping the future of the global order.
Well, I think we've given our listener plenty to ponder. I know I'm leaving this conversation with a whole new perspective on U.S.-China trade.
I'm glad to hear that. It's a topic that deserves careful consideration and ongoing dialogue.
I couldn't agree more. And, after this deep dive, I'm starting to see connections to so many other issues. Global politics, technological innovation, even climate change. It's all interconnected.
That's the beauty of learning. The more you explore, the more you realize how everything is connected.
It's truly a humbling and fascinating experience. Well, thank you again for joining me on this intellectual journey. It's been an absolute pleasure.
The pleasure was all mine.
And to our listener, thank you for sharing your curiosity with us. We hope this deep dive has been insightful and thought-provoking. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep exploring, and keep those brains curious.